This is Cultural Mixtapes. I'm Tejas Srinivasan. Welcome to the show. On today's episode, we have novelist, essayist, and professor Alexander Chee. He's the author of 2 novels, Edinburgh and The Queen of the Night, and one collection of essays called How to Write an Autobiographical Novel. He was also the editor for the 2022 edition of the Best American Essays Anthology, which was just published by HarperCollins. Alexander has the uncanny ability to methodically examine his own psyche while making connections that surprise both his reader and himself. His writing is guileless, and he's simultaneously able to control his prose while allowing his thoughts to meander, leading to an often shocking but infinitely exciting reading experience. He's always in complete control, but simultaneously at the mercy of his own creative muse. In a way, this conversation is quite similar to his work. I was pleasantly unaware of where we were drifting, and when it seemed like we had abandoned the premise of the question entirely, he would somehow veer back and connect a seemingly unrelated anecdote to precisely what I was going for. Most of the conversations thus far on Cultural Mixtapes have illuminated a certain aspect of the creative process and examined the reasons and drive behind art making. In addition to doing that, this conversation contains a sort of meta-commentary on how we examine our own processes and express them to others. A quick note, towards the end, I keep incorrectly referring to an interview Alexander gave to Guernica magazine. I later correct it to an essay that he actually wrote for the magazine, and that essay is linked below. Hope you enjoy the show. Alexander Chee, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the show.
It's nice to be here. Thank you.
So I want to start with your latest engagement and sort of work backwards from there. You're the editor for the 2022 edition of the anthology series, The Best American Essays. And the word best is quite a daunting tag for a project, especially one where you're compiling art. And on top of that, this series has had quite a lineup of editors, which pretty much includes the who's who of 20th and 21st century literature: David Foster Wallace, Joan Didion, Susan Sontag, the list goes on and on. So how did you come to this compilation project and approach it?
Well, I was invited by the series editor, Robert Atwan, and has since he began the series in 1986 with the first guest editor, who was Elizabeth Hardwick. And I approached it, I suppose. I talked about this a little bit in my introduction because I thought it might be interesting to people. It was and had been a dream for a long time to get to do this. It's also the kind of thing that seems so huge that it seems weird to dream about doing it. Sort of like looking at the White House on a visit and being like, yeah, maybe this will be me someday. So there was a way in which, like, when you're reading it every year, you engage in a certain amount of Monday morning quarterbacking, thinking about, like, who should have been in there, who really was your favorite, that you would have also chosen, that kind of thing. But it's very different when you're at the wheel and staring at like over 1,000 essays, not all at once, but like you're moving through a list. And so I was trying to think of like, what's my criteria going to be? And I thought of all of the different introductions I'd read over the years. I remember thinking like, oh, it'll be very clear which ones I should choose. But then I had chosen a lot of people as like a sort of semi-finalist list. And so I needed to call down to like the core group. And it was not the process that I thought it would be. So there were some essays where I would finish reading the essay and I would think that is definitely going in. And there were other essays I would read and I would think, oh my God, just sort of a little shaken and freaked out. And I would think, I should, or should I? I don't know. Is this essay too strange? But then I realized that the strangeness increasingly was what I valued. So like, Bauhini Vara's beautiful and moving essay about her like trying to write about her sister's death and using an AI to
Yeah.
write about it, where
Yeah.
she includes the text that the AI creates in response to what she puts forward, and she gradually is able to write it. These are the Dartmouth chimes. I'm very sorry about that
No worries.
because that adds little, shall we say, verisimilitude.
It's the proper New
I
England
really am at
experience.
Dartmouth. I did not lie.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I was looking for essays that I felt like were also methods of inquiry where someone was not certain of what they were going to end up with.
Hmm.
I began it. So Andrea Long Chu's essay, for example, where China Brain, where she's writing about getting treated with magnets for her depression, among many other things that come up in the process. And it's this really wide ranging essay that goes in all these different directions that you could not have expected at the beginning. It's written in the third person.
Yeah.
It's peculiar. It's a peculiar essay. And that's part of the beauty and power of it is that peculiarity. And so I think as a teacher, of course, there's always some tiny part of you that's like, you have to restrain. Because I was thinking to myself, I'm not grading these. I'm
Hmm.
not like, that's not what I'm after. I'm after a sensibility. And I realized that in many ways, I would not be able to describe what I was looking for until after I had found it.
Fascinating.
That the way to approach it was to allow what appealed to me in, as it were, and then afterwards to read it as a group and figure out what the connections were.
And I think even after this entire process, you have in your introduction this like quasi prose poem of the first lines of all of the essays, and it seems to work in a strange, wonderful manner.
No, thank you.
Um, on the same line of essays, but on the flip side, when you're writing an essay or even thinking about writing an essay, what do you look for in a topic that you think lends itself to that style?
Um, Usually I try to think of like some weird thing about myself that I've
Okay.
always accepted but never examined. So, for example, the other night I was watching Andor. A few nights before that, I had been watching the Halo TV show,
Hmm.
partly because it's like a K drama. There's like a Korean character
Oh, okay.
who's like a Korean rebel, and I was, of course, in the future there would be Korean rebels living on a distant mining planet who were like fighting for their independence from the entire galactic civilization spawned by space colonization. And of course, they would be scrappy and have like cool haircuts. Uh, the prompt I gave for myself was sort of first a realization, which was like, wow, I will watch anything that has a really cool abandoned spaceship in it.
Okay.
And then I was like, why? Why am I like that? Where does that come from? And then I started writing an essay. In my first collection, I have an essay that begins with me just thinking about why it is when someone asks me, do you want a receipt? I freeze with this like moment of anxiety. And the person, of course, is like moving along. And meanwhile, I'm having some kind of existential moment. And so I thought, all right, I have to write about that. And that's how that essay came to be.
You mentioned before that you like essays where the writer doesn't seem to know where they're going to end up. Are you the same way when you start a piece?
Yeah, I think so. It's I think part of the pleasure of an essay is watching someone think in front of you and watching them also be vulnerable about that process.
Hmm.
There's a certain triumphal trope in essays that has been described, that I try to watch out for, which is I had a problem and then I solved it. And that's great. Those essays are great for the other people who have the problem who are like, how am I going to solve this problem? if they're honest. And so I think I would describe my own approach as being not so much I have a problem, but as in like I have this eccentricity, or I have this approach, or I have this question. I have a even a mystery, if you will. Like I have a book of spaceships, for example, from my childhood,
Okay.
just like sci-fi art of the 70s and 80s.
Hmm.
That was new at the time that I bought it. It was not vintage, and or when it was bought for me, rather. And it's one of my oldest companions. Um, that will probably be part of the essay.
Lovely. Speaking of processes that you mentioned, several artists and writers that I've talked to or even just watched on YouTube have a very difficult time explaining their creative process or even how they've made their work. Whereas in your collection, How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, there's just uncanny writing that clinically spells out this process that seems so elusive. Yet there's still that impalpable sense of this is art that comes from somewhere that I might not have full control of. It's hard to place a word on it, but how do you think about your own writing in your own process?
Hmm. Well, I probably approach it the same way, which is by which I mean like the way I just described it for you.
Mhm.
I'm always interested in thinking about thinking.
Okay.
That's part of it. I am usually coming up with, sorry, this is
No worries. No worries.
strangely difficult. So part of that comes from just being a teacher and having to articulate that for people. I think so much of what we do as teachers is to try to say aloud some things that we know, but in ways that we have not described before in front of our students,
Okay.
and usually comes about as a result of questions. So I love my students' questions when they come, and I'm always appreciative of them because they are opportunities for this kind of thinking. I remember a student who asked me a long time ago when I was teaching my first university class as a graduate student. This was at the University of Iowa. I was teaching rhetoric, and she was one of my favorite students. And she said, "How do you know what to read?"
Wow. Quite a question.
A huge question,
Yeah.
yeah. And I just sort of I looked at her with a bit of amazement, thinking like, "Oh, what an incredible question!" Like to think about it. And she said, "You're so well read. You know so much. You've read so many books. Like, how do you know what books to read?" I thought, it's so interesting to have to articulate that. I remember kind of winging it in person, and I said something along the lines of how I will browse at a bookstore and flip a book open, and or at a library and see if the voice in the book catches me, something that pulls me in. Of course, there's more to it than that, and I started to describe for her how I would be in class, and my teachers at the time in Iowa, Deborah Eisenberg or Dennis Johnson, I would mention a book, and I would go rushing off after class to used bookstores in town to see if I could find a copy. And if I couldn't, I would write it down, or I might, if I felt rich, I would try to order it. And, the library was a busy place. It became a sort of sport at the workshop of a kind, an unofficial thing we were all doing. I'm sure it's still happening now there. There's like waves of things that are being read at the workshop at a particular given time because some teacher started talking about it.
Oh, wow.
And so what I was trying to describe for her, I realize now, like looking back, I would say to her, this is how you can start thinking about a lineage for a writer. And what are the books that helped them become the writer they are? And if you like their writing, you can search now online. It's never been easier to find out what a particular writer was reading along the way.
You would say you approach writing about your own process as if you're just answering students' questions, basically?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way to approach answering those kinds of questions, though, roughly a few steps that I keep in mind. What are the things that no one ever bothers to describe,
Yeah.
but that would actually help if somebody described it? What is the way you can find something that other people have just not thought to say yet about something that everybody thinks about or that everybody participates in? I remember a moment where I was like on a train going from Amherst, Massachusetts into New York City, and there were these two very young kids in front of me who were talking, and one of them said in response to something the other said, "What you talking about, Willis?" There's a moment where the other person looked at them and said, "What do you mean?" He's like, "What do you mean? What do I mean?" And they're like, "Well, what is that from?" He said, "Well, everybody knows what that's from." And it was like this fragment, like a catchphrase from a sitcom that I had watched as a kid that traveled to these children almost like some sort of cultural artifact. Well, it was in fact a cultural artifact. And the one didn't actually know where it came from because he was like, everybody knows where that's from. At first, he was trying to play it off like,
Yeah.
yeah, don't like, what do you mean you don't know? And then he he didn't know. And I thought, is it worse somehow for me to lean over and tell them the TV show this is from, or do I just let it play out? Because it was such an interesting conversation to listen to.
It sounds
Or
like an Abbott and Costello skit happening right in front of you.
totally. So I love stuff like that, and I love thinking
Okay.
about it.
Now, the question I've been dancing around for the past how many ever minutes or so. Now that you're in general, both throughout fiction, nonfiction, now that you're two novels and a book of essays in, what does your writing process look like after thinking through these ideas?
What does it look like? Well, it's funny, something that I've started doing, especially when I'm teaching, is I've started writing on my phone.
Okay.
Because then I can just do it whenever. And so I remember my colleague across the hall here is the poet Vivi Francis. One day she said something to the effect of like, "You are so productive. Like, when are you writing?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm always writing." And she said, "But I never see you writing." And I said, "Well, you see me on my phone, right?" And she said, "Yes." And I was like, "Well, I'm writing on my phone." And she was sort of thrown by that. It's something that I started doing because the poet Avon Boland did it. And I had met her as a part of like a job search in like 2010. And she was telling me about how she used her phone for writing. And I remember first thinking like, what? And then I thought, oh, yes, that makes sense. And there is some kind of a way that in general in my writing process, it helps me if I don't feel like I'm sitting down to be like, and now I will write great literature. So if it feels like I'm just kind of texting somebody, except it's me, then the pressure's off, and then I can just write something. Sometimes I will open an email in Gmail and send it to myself. I started doing it in earnest when I was a part of something called The Grind. Are you familiar with The Grind?
No, I'm not.
The Grind is a kind of an accountability practice, a
Okay.
monthly one, where you sign up and you are put in a group with like, I think it's something like anywhere between 9 to 14 people.
Mm-hmm.
And you send each other what you're writing every day, and you have to send something every day
Okay.
for the month. And you cannot miss a day, partly because you doing it prompts everybody else to do it. You cannot comment on the things that other people send. You're just supposed to open the email and respond with your own. It's very funny. I told my agent about it. And she's like, "That is an IP nightmare." But it really has helped me, especially when I'm very busy. And it also became part of why when I was busy, I would write on my phone. So it helped me write while I was on book tour for the
Mm-hmm.
essay collection. It helped me, when I had a busy teaching schedule. It was so easy at the end of the day. I would sometimes like go out to my car because also I find that it helps when I'm in some kind of liminal space, which is to say, like when I'm somewhere where nobody knows that I'm there exactly. Not that it's so mysterious that I'm in my car in a parking lot on campus, but like Like I could sit there and write for 20 minutes, which or half an hour on my phone, hit send and meet my grind requirement, and then drive home. And that's like, I got something written, was doing part of the first draft. I was doing it, for example, partly while I was watching Andor after I had that idea to write the essay. So I like took some notes very quickly. And but I have this beautiful office which I also write in, and I have a writing cabinet at home, which is by contrast very spare. There's
Hmm.
no shelves in it. There's just a desk, a chair, a lamp, and a huge couch that ironically is a couch that I used to hate, which I can just kind of fall on when I
Hmm.
need to lay down as a part of the writing practice. But I will write just about anywhere. I'm very lucky to have fancy places now. I don't need one. I am happy. I wrote my first novel on the subway back and forth from Brooklyn to Midtown.
So, moral of the story is write absolutely everywhere.
I
Pretty much.
guess.
Hey,
Yeah.
it's good
Um,
advice.
I was talking to my friend Sabina Murray and then also my friend Julia Glass. Both of them are moms. Both of them have written lots of books. And, it's like kind of a conventional wisdom that if you are a mom, that your writing career will stop. So I was asking them like, how did you get through it? And they were just like, bring it with you and you write. Like Sabina would write while she was waiting to pick up her kids. She would write, in the parking lot. Like Julie Glass was much the same way. I think
Wow.
I met her at this very fancy writing residency in Italy called Civitella Ranieri, where you're in a castle, somebody makes your meals for you. It's like beautiful Italian food. It's kind of like being at a dinner party for 5 weeks.
Okay.
um, and she was saying to me, I get interrupted all the time at home. If I couldn't write with interruption because of an interruption, I would never get anything done. We were discussing my own particular moment of fussiness when she like knocked on the door. And I was like, Julia, I'm trying to, like, I'm sorry. However, you are too precious.
Lovely. Kind of switching gears over to a specific
Yeah.
essay. Yours. In your collection, you have an essay called The Guardians. It's examining the effects of the trauma of an incident of sexual abuse. I don't want to give it away. It's such a profound reading experience. But
Thank you.
you're quite literally able to analyze your own psyche. It's reflections on top of analysis on a particular memory. And when I spoke to the essayist Joanne Beard for this series over the summer, she talked about
Mm,
how a memory is a starting point, and then the process of working through that memory, whether it's gaining clarity or imagining around it, is the writing process. Whether it's in essays or in your fiction, do you trust your memories at first when you start to think about them?
no. My writing process is informed by a great deal of mistrust in my memory,
Okay.
which is to say, yes, I would say the memory is definitely the starting point, but then the second thing that happens is I think, okay, but is it right? And I think one thing that I've definitely learned over time as a writer is that the memories that I am most sure of are the ones that I really need to check. So I have an assignment with my students where I have them fact check a family story, for example,
Okay.
which has created some incredible essays from them. It's also a part of like teaching them to use primary sources and teaching them to interview people. And they've learned a lot about who they are and where things come from in their lives. I think of families as a kind of anthology of memories.
Hmm.
Everybody remembers a different
Yeah.
thing, and you end up with, I guess, more than an anthology, it's more of like a stereoscopic narrative, a story told
Hmm.
from two or more points of view. So
Hmm.
you have your sense of how a particular event went. Your brother has his, your sister has hers, your parents have theirs. Eventually, like if you talk to all of them about it, you can gather together something that's composed out of what everybody knew. And that's always a more interesting thing to me than just what I remembered.
Hmm.
That said, if that's all you have, that's all you have, and then you just try to work with that, but with a willingness to consider how you might have changed or otherwise occluded memory.
Fascinating. You talk about family stories and how they're an anthology of different perspectives of the same event. You said in an interview a long time ago in 2008, it was about how your view of Korea was quite subjective, relayed to you by family. And once I read that, I realized that my view of pretty much anywhere is kind of based on who I was with, what was going on at the time, and so on and so
Mhm.
forth. Once you have all the perspectives and you've done all the research, how do you reconcile that in your writing? Because oftentimes there is not really one answer.
Something that I realized for the book that one of the books that I'm writing now is that I needed to read and research enough to understand the stories that my family had told me,
Hmm.
maybe even ways that they didn't mean for me to understand them.
Okay.
I had an interesting moment. So something that I do so that I don't just like turn into a stone is I have a treadmill in the basement. I go down there and I watch TV on the treadmill. And oftentimes I will watch K-dramas, and partly because they are just like so far away from the world that I'm living in now, this sort of like, Eastern Vermont, like it couldn't be more different. And yet it's also familiar in another way. Part of it also is like I'll have these moments where I really miss Seoul. And so like, I'll watch a K-drama set in Seoul and I'll get to see the landscape. But where is this going? Oh, I remember. So I was watching this one K-drama called 2521. And the IMF crisis in Korea in the 90s is a big part of the story. You couldn't say it's the plot, it's more like the historical setting or the historical event that was happening and changing everyone's life at the same time, sort of like a financial pandemic, if you will. And so the thing that was so interesting to me to observe in the story was one, how there were characters going through things that my family in Korea had gone through around that time. And I was able, at the time I wasn't able to understand it. But because I was seeing it play out this way, I thought, oh, that explains this.
Oh,
This is why this happened. I was making all these connections about my family's history that I was not prepared to do while watching this K-drama, which is otherwise like not really like my family's story. It was also a fascinating comment on like I guess realism and also how much America keeps current events out. Stories like that. Like what sitcom can you think of that is informed by like the 2008 financial crisis in the United States? Was there one?
I'm not sure. No.
Yeah, I
Wow.
can't think of one.
From what you just said, in that same interview, you also say that you found the brand of the contemporary Asian American writer a problem. This was 14 years ago. How does
Yeah.
that sentiment stand with you today? And
Was this my interview with Matthew Salesses?
it was on Guernica, I believe.
Oh,
It was an essay. I don't think my bad. It wasn't
it
an
was an
interview.
essay.
It was an essay.
Yeah.
My bad.
Okay, I know what you're talking about. I think there was something that I was trying to get at then that I didn't have language for,
Mhm.
which is like approximately like how do we convey our sense of who we are on the page. I'm thinking of like Edward P. Jones, for example. When you read Edward P. Jones's stories, he doesn't say, "Hey, all of these characters are black," but it comes through in
Yeah.
the writing. Like, and sometimes he will just say it, but a lot of times he won't. He makes the whole story say it. And I think something that I had gotten a little or a lot interested in, and what I was talking about at the time, was also informed by like conversations I was having at the Asian American Writers Workshop
Hmm.
with friends, writers there, where we were thinking about like what does it mean to convey authenticity? What does it mean to how do we write stories to each other? So I read an excerpt, for example, from another of the books I'm working on now, a novel at Breadloaf a couple of years ago, and I had this young Korean American writer who was there, come up to me afterwards and he said, he's like, I love that so much. I really appreciated the way it was about what he called East Asian confusion.
Okay.
And I laughed and I thought, oh my God, yes, that is what it's about. The character's Korean American. He has a white friend who he calls like his white friend most likely to end up at a Korean wedding. Because he only dates Korean women. And so he's getting married to a Korean woman and they're having a Korean ceremony. And so he's gone and he realizes when he goes that he has never been to a Korean wedding. Uh, and and so he's there and he's like, is it because I'm gay that they don't invite me? Like, why don't I get invited to the Korean weddings? He realizes that his other family members have not done traditional Korean weddings either.
Mhm.
His parents never brought it up. He didn't even know like
Oh,
what
wow.
would be involved. So there's all these thoughts and feelings he's having as he's at the ceremony where he's in this particular scene that I read from, where he's just thinking like, what is going on in my
Yeah.
life? Who is my family? Why was I raised like this? And that to me is more interesting than what I think I felt like was happening in the early aughts, where I felt like I saw stuff that would make me pause and think about like, is this what I want to be participating in, or is this what I
Yeah.
want to do? So I think that's what I was talking about when I thought of it as
Mhm.
problematic. I think I was younger and more. How does it hold up? I think I would look back at me then and be like, "You're a little judgmental." Is what I would probably say.
Our final general question. What have you been reading, watching? We've talked a lot about K dramas. What have you been reading, watching, or listening to that you've enjoyed lately?
Uh, let's see. Right now, I am listening to the audiobook of Lost in the City by Edward P. Jones,
Mhm.
uh, which is a book I have read, but I have not listened to it.
Mhm.
And I'm really enjoying that as a way to just be with the stories in a different way and to think about them and how they're created.
Mhm.
I just taught Asymmetry by Lisa Halliday,
Okay.
which is a novel that came out a few years ago that it's kind of a fantastic novel to teach because it's some really high level trolling of your students basically.
Okay. Okay.
All the things that students are worried about today like is kind of in this novel, a little bit like a pizza that you order that has like half mushroom, half pepperoni. I hope Lisa Halliday never hears me say that.
Now
But
this is quite
anyway,
a sell. I'm picking this up right now.
it is an extraordinary
Okay.
novel. I think also because one part of it is autofiction, the other part is not. And the way that it ends, the whole novel kind of accomplishes this meditation on the different kinds of fiction writing that you do. There's a invocation of Stephen Crane that's particularly memorable.
Mhm.
When do you ever hear about Stephen Crane? Especially the essays. It's also about like the national security state that we've all been asked to live inside of currently, or asked is a strong word, that we are all living inside of,
Yeah.
whether we asked for it or not. Um, that one definitely, and really loving this group called Cannons.
Okay.
And I just finished Dancer from the Dance by Andrew Holleran, which I listened to, which is a kind of classic gay novel from the 1970s about gay New York. And it is so hilarious,
Okay.
obscene, profane, disgusting, bizarre, over the top. It has a remarkable magic to it. There's a lot of racism in it,
Okay.
which I had to. I remember thinking as I was listening to it when it first started coming up, thinking like, "Oh God, I forgot. It's true how racist gay New York was back when I first arrived in the 1980s,
Mhm.
and how there was a certain kind of white person who would just say all these different kinds of things that get said in novel
Hmm.
and expect you to just roll along. And if you were to have called them conservative in any way, they would have been shocked. Yeah. So it was fascinating in ways that I did not expect.
I believe that is all. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And that's our show. Special thanks to Alexander Chee for joining me on this episode. To see a list of his recommendations and learn more about his work, visit the show notes. Cultural Mixtapes is written and produced by me, Tejas Srinivasan. The music you heard on today's episode was Beethoven's Sonata number 26 and Chopin's Sonata number 2, recorded by me. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe, review, and share on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you listen. Thank you very much for listening.